So do you want to open it up or?
Yeah, I think we got the sign that we need to open it up. So, are there microphones? Okay.
So 2 comments and a question. The first comment is that I worked at the Social Science Research Council in 1990 and 91 as it was in the process of decommissioning all of its area studies focus and ending programs to train people in area studies, partly because the funding sources said the Cold War is over, the world has changed, area studies is too inward-looking. Yes, anyone who needs to study a certain area of the world should know the language, obviously, but as you say, it's not theoretical enough, it's not related to the social sciences enough, and so on. And it was a very interesting period, and I don't know how much they documented the debate about that, but I think they did get rid of the old without fully knowing the way forward to something new. So I think it's a problem that hasn't been solved. The second comment that I would make is, I mean, you've outlined layers from, or scales from global to regional to national to urban to neighborhood to individual. And those are all conceptually important levels of analysis in the social sciences. And I think it's true to say that for much of the past 50 or 60 years, that social sciences proceeded as if either the nation or the individual were the only important scales of analysis, and the other areas, the other sort of spatial levels, dimensions have been faded out of analysis, and in the past 20 years, they're coming back in the sense that if you take extreme statements like Saskia Sassen, for example, believes the nation has pretty much collapsed as an important dimension, and the global and the local are the most important. Or others are stressing the fact that national models of X, Y, and Z don't really hold up because race relations in Marseille could be very different from race relations in Paris, for example. So you can't really talk about a French model. And so clearly the intellectual importance of the different scales have been changing in important ways. And the question I would throw back at you is which scales have been scalar levels have been underappreciated in the past that you think really should be pushed forward in analysis in the coming 20 years or so?
That's a really interesting question, because in some ways I think it's a scale that has yet to have a name, because I think it's being produced as we speak. I mean, the way, and it's no longer one particular scale, but it's really that in-between scale. Like, how do these things relate to one another? People are not just operating on the local versus national, even three, or even regional, local, national. They're trying to penetrate, that's why mobility, of course, I mean, that's one of the hallmarks of globalization. That actually, its full effects is still, I think, are still unfolding. So I think maybe perhaps it would change our idea of scale altogether. But right now, that's the only thing I can think about where at least it flags all these different levels on which we have operated. And I think hopefully once we're able to think about how to talk about them in conjunction with one another, right? That then this scale and the way that you're defining or that way you're asking me about it will actually be of secondary importance. Does that make any sense? It's not terribly, this is something actually that I'm trying to work out right now. But I just have the feeling, and I think it's something that's yet to be defined, or at least once we actually put into practice and not just agreeing theory about how all these different scales should interact somehow and show a greater dynamism than has been allowed for, then in some ways the notion of scale itself would not matter that much.
And I would just add to that. Actually, my thinking about it is somewhat similar in the sense that I think what we haven't done is most of the quantitative studies, at least, have just focused on one level of local, whether it's a census tract, metropolitan area, county, whatever it is. And I think that people haven't really looked at whether we get effects, looking at the same processes or outcomes, looking at different levels, or interacting those levels together. And I guess for Anand, how can I make that a little more clear? I just think that we need to look at different levels of analysis at the local to see if the same sorts of processes and dynamics are going on. And I think people have not done that. They have their one level that they like to study, and they go with it. And I think that, it may be what Jing is talking about, that there is a way that we're going to start to think about how these different local contexts interact to create some new form or new local space. I don't know.
So I wanted to make a comment and then ask a question. The comment is that both the tension between theory and data and the different levels of analysis arise all the time in science. And you might find either some inspiration or something distressing there, but you might want to look at those and how they've been handled. The question is about the influence of technology on what it means to be local, because local has till very recently been thought of as geographic and physical proximity, but from economic opportunity, where there are now people all around the world on mechanical Turk earning, a daily living, while people in the developed countries think they're paying nothing for work to get done. So it's certainly changed the notion also of what a community is, and what the spheres of interaction are. I think it's also changed language, and I was struck, Jing, when you were talking about modern Chinese and literature, and what both Chinese and literature mean, and who's in the local speaking community is not now necessarily who lives nearby. So I just wanted to ask you each to comment on where, as you look forward, where you see technology influencing and maybe helping to break out of the old modes.
That was my question.
Barbie says that was her question too.
Terrific. I actually would emphasize the tendency in the opposite direction. Yes, in some ways we rely on technology and ideas of globalization as ways of breaking out barriers, but in fact we don't, right? And that to me is actually so ultimately I guess I'm an individual scalist, obviously from literature, but I think there is a way in which despite, you would think, if we just let globalization or this idea of mobility take over, then we wouldn't be having this conversation about difficulties and why it doesn't work the way that we think it should. So I think this actually comes down to something that actually is very it's sort of internal limit to ideas of technology, which is actually a very human aspect. And obviously being a humanist, this is not a surprise that you will hear this coming from me. But I think I think in the way that John was talking about earlier, the individual scale, I think for sociologists it's actually kind of two-dimensional, I would argue, right? You don't want to know about people's ambivalences or, self-torment when you're thinking about individual and sociology. That's not what you're interested in. You're interested in sort of these, neat, how do we pare things down so individuals can be accountable for their actions, say what they mean what they say. But of course, individual to me is all about inner torments and obsessive personalities and actually often committing oneself to actions that are contrary to what one desires, which makes individuals kind of unpredictable. So it's a kind of like a little vibration that goes on the individual level that I think is largely not of too much interest. But for me, there's a way, at least that's what I'm trying to work on now, there's a way in which this this level of this packet of passions, emotions, and maybe incoherent social meaning that somehow on this human level can actually tell us or can be connected somehow to the biggest picture I can think of, which is sort of Chinese literature in the global context, where we deal with different communities of writers, language, almost like structural institutional issues. But then I think it has to be somehow connected, or it should be, or I think the most fruitful venue would be to somehow make the individual on the level I'm talking about relevant and offer some kind of explanatory force to huge scale questions, right? So ultimately this is, and I actually think, and I hope you hear, which you might not, that implicit in the background is actually, I'm interested in the larger, on the broadest level, is really a dialogue between social scientists and the humanities, right? I mean, is it true? I'm basically testing out, trying to think about, is it true that when we get bigger, that would mean we can't get smaller, right? With our details and our sensitivity and things like that.
I'll briefly say about technology. I do think that, I think it's a great question because obviously technologies, we're just going to get more of it. And I do think that, there have been studies that are looking at kind of online communities and how it affects, the different configurations of communities. But I do think that, I do still think that kind of people are still grounded in a location and a place. Even though we're moving around a lot, we're traveling. And I do think a lot of it is tied to things like, still tied to individual level characteristics like race and social class that we have to also be mindful of. And I guess the way that I think about technology, I guess I think about it more as creating an additional community, not really displacing the communities that we have today. But again, I think it's an empirical question that we'll have to think about. So.
Okay, am I on? First, a very specific example of why the level that Jing has been talking about matters. There's a really important book by an anthropologist named Akhil Gupta called Post-Colonial Developments. And he's writing about green revolution technologies in India, but arguing very strongly that you cannot understand what's going on with green agriculture, quote-unquote green agricultural technologies in India without understanding both the local and the multinational levels. And I think that's a really, really pressing problem in anthropology right now, and people are really working very hard on exactly this issue of getting at what's going on when you've got something like a multinational corporation dealing at both the local and the global level. So it's just an example, but the other is a question that when the economic crisis hit, I imagine this happened to a bunch of people in their universities. The university went off, my university, Cornell, went off and said, well, what are we going to do about it? The solution that came back was a solution proposed by a Shakespeare scholar who didn't get it, to get rid of everything called studies. That would include feminist gender sexuality studies, my field, science and technology studies, all of the area studies programs, including Cornell's extraordinary Asian studies of various sorts, farm those all back out into the home methodological disciplines of the particular faculty members, put all those lines back in big departments, big silos. And needless to say, there was more than a little pushback, but I think that the question that comes up then when looking at issues like local and global and area studies is what kinds of justifications can we come up with to say, that's a really bad idea. I have a few, but I'm wondering if this crowd would also have other possibilities. It's not going to happen at Cornell, by the way, so. But it's a fight.
I don't know why I just thought of this and it should be expunged from the final version of this, but Gaddafi said something similar about Switzerland after his son was arrested. He just cut it up and sort of turned it apart to Germany and to France and so on and so forth.